Kathy.
Hi, this is Kathy Mink. I'm the coordinator for the Province 5 Suicide Prevention Network. It is April 6, 2021. It's about 11:20, and we are hosting a meeting with Soul Shop. Michelle Snyder will be presenting to us.
Okay.
Michelle.
Yeah, hi. So I guess I haven't introduced myself to any of you. My name's Michelle Snyder. I'm currently sitting in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the co-director of Soul Shop lives. So he was on earlier, but I'm actually from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So Western Pennsylvania girl, born and raised. And that's, I guess, Soul Shop's mailing address is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Just super quick about who I am and what I do. I have a dual degree in social work and divinity. So I've got a master's in divinity. I'm seminary educated. I have not pastored very much, done some pulpit supply, done some chaplaincy, but I've never been a pastor. I did meet my husband in seminary. He is a pastor. So I'm Presbyterian, PCUSA by marriage, clergy spouse. So I always say, if you're a praying person, I could use it. So I went to seminary, got a master's in divinity, realized really quick that I hate to preach. I'm an extrovert, and as an extrovert, I am dialogical. And so a blank screen where I got to sit down and know what people need me to say to them just scares the bejesus out of me. So I would, I'm a great trainer and presenter because I can interact with my crowd. I hate to preach. So seminary degree I've got, and I don't want to be a pastor. So I went back to school and I got my master's in social work. Which has been a perfect intersection for me. And so what that degree set means, I don't love when people lead with their resume, but it does say something about kind of the intersection of my passions, which is the place where mental health and the life of the church come together. And you're all on here because you obviously already understand that, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't necessarily make that obvious connection. So I've worked as a therapist. I have a lot of pastors as clients, and I'm kind of passionate about whatever place the church can be a conduit for health and healing and hope in people's lives, even as it relates to health and wellness. So that's who I am, and that's what I do. I've got 2 teenage daughters, so if you're inclined to pray, I'll take it. They're 15 and 16, which is lovely. So you're here to hear about Soul Shop. Soul Shop is an organization, and I mean, it helps to talk about its origins. It was started by my friend and colleague, who I still talk to on a very regular basis. His name is Faye Onum Avis, and he was a pastor in Southern Ohio, actually, in Columbus. In the early 90s in a small town. He was a small town pastor in a large church. And so, if you know that thing, like you end up with lots of civic responsibilities as a small town pastor or a large church pastor in a small town. So anyway, this small town, they had a graduating class, high school of about 300 kids. And in one academic year, 3 of them died by suicide. So in this one graduating class, they had a suicide, I think in October, a suicide in November, and a suicide in April. And it rocked this small community, obviously, as you would know that it would. And they didn't have a lot of resources in this small town. And so Faye, personally, pastor, kind of looked around and said, somebody needs to do something about this. And so he got trained in suicide prevention. And the suicide prevention training he got trained in was called Safe Talk. And he says, I would go all around Southern Ohio, these, small communities, training people in suicide prevention. And I would be in a fire hall or a community center or something, and we would get 100 people to come because there was such interest in this topic. He said there would be nurses and teachers and firefighters and concerned parents and grandparents and kind of all manner of people. But he said consistently, as I looked around, I realized like we're not getting any pastors. Like pastors were not showing up for this conversation. Maybe one, maybe two, maybe none. But of all of the places that could be making a real difference, it was the clergy that were absent. And so he asked himself the question, what is it about the way that we're talking about suicide that's not capturing the theological imagination of the church? And out of that is Soul Shop was born. He decided we need to write this. Number one, my observation is that when you're talking about doing suicide prevention or any other kind of mental health ministry, what you're really talking about is the introduction of culture change in terms of our self-identity, in terms of how we think about how we live and move and have our being. It requires more than just sort of a mental health month or a suicide prevention Sunday. It requires a real shift in our self-understanding. And I think anytime you're doing culture change work, it takes insiders to change a culture, right? We don't welcome outsiders coming in telling us how we need to do things differently. And so I think one of the things that's worked about Soul Shop is that a pastor wrote it for pastors. And as insiders, we can say to each other, we're getting this wrong in a way that previously secular suicide prevention resources have not been very welcomed. I think, Marna, didn't you tell a story about trying to bring AFSP into the church and it was not well received at all?
Yeah, I mean, I was so excited about the resource, and I had met with Wendy and blah 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 blah, and I'm like, come on, let's go do this. And I had such a small turnout, and it reminds me of Kathy and I have talked, and we had a speaker before about the questions theologically. I love what you just said about it doesn't capture, AFSP does not capture the theological imagination. And that's where I think the church really needs people that speak that language to also speak about suicide prevention, because I think people saw that as an add-on instead of a culture shift.
Right.
I love what you said that. Yeah. So
yeah. So what Soul Shop is, and what he wrote that day that has taken off into a movement that I now run, is it's a day-long workshop. And just to give you kind of a little flavor for Soul Shop, what I start with is the story of the woman with the issue of blood. So we immediately go biblical and talk about this woman who had spent all the money that she had and couldn't get well, and came up behind Jesus in the crowd and she touched the hem of his garment. And so I talk about, okay, here's a woman who had a very socially stigmatized condition. We've got someone who had an embarrassing situation that was draining her resources. She couldn't talk about it. She was ceremonially unclean as a result of it, right? So kind of paralleling that with some of the mental health stuff that we deal with. And how did Jesus deal with that situation? He turned around and he saw her. And when he saw her, she fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And so I talk about, what does it look like to see people? What is our role in turning around to find the people among us who are invisible but stigmatized? So we introduced that biblical concept. We then look at Job. Job has a prayer where he says, I can get no rest. I'm terrorized by day, and at night I'm tortured by my dreams. I would rather be dead than deal with what I'm dealing with. And so there's this kind of suicidality in the way that the desperation Job was experiencing. So we talk about Job and his suicidality. And so I tell you that to just give you a flavor for when I talk about capturing the theological imagination. In Soul Shop, we don't lead with statistics and data and necessarily tools or resources. We lead with, is this theologically or scripturally relevant to what it means to be people of faith? And do we have a call and a mandate to do this work? So one of the things we talk about in Soul Shop, and I actually start here, is we're not just talking about ending suicide, which we are. We want to save lives, and that's a primary driver. But we've got suicide impacts in our congregations that are prolific and diverse. We've got people in the congregation who are thinking about suicide. We know that 6% of adults and 17% of adolescents are thinking about suicide at any given time. I say that in the first 15 minutes of Soul Shop, because, sometimes we wonder, I will always say 6% of adults and 17% of adolescents. And so if you're asking yourself, do I have anyone in my church who's thinking about suicide? You're asking yourself the wrong question. The right question is, which 6% or which 6 people out of my 100 here today are currently thinking about suicide? Of the 25 or 20 to 25 kids in my youth group, which 3 or 4 of them today are thinking about suicide? That's the right question. So that changes the conversation in that way. But you've also got people who are worried about someone who might be thinking about suicide. You've got people who have lost someone to suicide. You've got people who have been suicidal in the past and never shared their stories. And when you put all of those factors together, all of the impacts of suicide, you're probably talking about 50% of your congregation. And so this is something that touches most of us, or half of us, or whatever. And if I love the people sitting to my left and my right, then it impacts all of us. So we're kind of creating the context whereby I'm saying to pastors, it's in the Bible and you need to care because it's under your roof, right? Then we teach the tools and tips, pretty similar to what AFSP might teach, but all with kind of sprinkled with theological language, biblical stories, that kind of thing. So that's kind of how we spend our morning in Soul Shop. In the afternoon, we say, like, okay, so what would it look like if we did change our culture? What would it look like for us to take seriously the call to bind up the brokenhearted and release captives from, release the captives and whatever that Isaiah passage is. What would it look like if we were really serious about doing that? Well, we would preach about this. So where is there suicide in the Bible? And I spend about 45 minutes to an hour, maybe 45 minutes, looking at a variety of scripture passages that could be preached about and taught about. Elijah went under a tree and prayed to die. Jonah said, you'd all be better off without me. Why don't you just get rid of me? There are a couple Old Testament characters in David's story. King Saul, the first king of Israel, died by suicide, right? You've got the Gerasene demoniac who was slashing him, self-harm kinds of things. You've got, Judas died by suicide. Samson actually died by suicide. You can go on and on and on through these stories. And talk about how would we preach about this? How would you teach about this? What would be some ways that you could incorporate this into your regular kind of integrated Bible study, that kind of thing. We talk about what would it look like to be praying and using these words on a regular basis, praying and using the word suicide, praying for survivors of suicide. I then have people write prayers and we pray them together. So we almost have a worship service in the middle of the day. It's incredibly powerful. It's not very often. I don't know denominationally who you're going to gather, but I've done this where I've had Buddhist priests and Pentecostal African Americans all praying together in one space. And they get up at the microphone and one person's praying in tongues. And then the next person, the Unitarian, gets up and, sort of offers a wish for the world. And then the Catholic gets up and crosses. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. We talk about outreach opportunities in the community. We talk about how we kind of even create the infrastructure of where do you put resource templates in your building? What are the resource templates that you need to have in your building? What is the level of training that you want all your people to do? And how would you organize around that kind of intentional discipleship towards mental health ministry, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm using a lot of words, but just to give you the frame for how we do this day and what we do. I'll pull back from that a little bit and say, Faye wrote that. showed up, and it was Cleveland, Ohio, was the first place he did it. 80 pastors showed up after having done it repeatedly. It might have been with the diocese, the Catholic diocese, I don't know, but 80 pastors showed up. They loved it. He got another request. And eventually, sort of, we were friends for other reasons. He asked me, given my background, those kind of dueling interests, if I would be willing to take it and make it a thing, which I've done. I brought Christopher in not all that long ago to help direct it, to be the co-director. So we do it together now. And I've done Soul Shop in give or take 37 states and 4 countries for thousands of people. We got the attention of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and have become their preferred provider for faith-based suicide prevention services. And one of the things we do, we have a public health approach to suicide. The public health approach to suicide says, number one, prevention matters and can make a huge difference. When you catch things at stage 4, your prognosis isn't always great. But if we can create a culture whereby the community knows what to look for, everybody thinks that suicide is my job, my responsibility, and my problem, we can catch things early. We all know what we're looking for, that kind of thing. So one of the ways we do that is that AFSP has, Chris, how many chapters of AFSP? I don't know, 79, I think, something like that. There's a chapter in every single state. And so I've made it my, kind of my work, and he's very well connected, to know when we're going to a state to connect folks with AFSP chapters. So for instance, when Marna called and said, I want to do this in the Upper Peninsula, I said, well, we're doing 2 of these in Michigan in the next, we've got them on the books and it's through the AFSP chapter. Let's connect you, or maybe you connected yourself, I can't remember, but now there's a collaboration and AFSP is working with the diocese to bring this in. We've got connections in Ohio, and because we've done it in 37 states, we're able to make that connection. But one of the things I do at the end of a Soul Shop is give a list of possible next steps. And one of the next steps is, would you like to be person who's involved, or person who attended Soul Shop, would you like to be connected to the AFSP chapter in your community to learn more about walks and how to volunteer? And so we make that connection for people. One of the things we do with our hosts as we're coming in is ask them to put together a resource template. Do the research to find out where the domestic violence shelter is in your community, where the homeless shelter is, where the LGBTQ resources are, what's the, et cetera, who are the resources you think you need to have. And then we distribute those to everyone who attends the Soul Shop. So they leave with a list of mental health resources, as well as some ideas about how to get those distributed. So that's what Soul Shop is, and that's what we do. We are frequently brought in by ministeriums, which would be denominationally diverse and geographically concentrated. We are frequently brought in by middle judicatory folks. So I trained all the Methodist pastors in Vermont and all the Methodist pastors in New Hampshire right before COVID hit. AFSP worked with their conference and brought us in for a denominational gathering. I've trained all the youth pastors, the ELCA youth pastors in North Carolina. So usually those are statewide gatherings. So that's another way we get brought in. Sometimes faith-based counseling centers are good partners. So we'll bring those in. So good hosts and planning teams are often, get a mental health partner, find a faith-based counseling center that'll partner, get a congregational or judicatory partner. In New Hampshire, the I don't know what he is, but the head of the State Council of Churches collaborated on this thing. And of course, that was very successful. And then get a suicide prevention partner like AFSP. So So that's what we do. I'll stop there and let you ask me some questions or talk amongst yourselves.
Can I just say that a couple more people while you were talking arrived? So Michelle and Rayford, you're here too. I don't see you. Yay. This is Michelle. Michelle, this is Michelle.
Yeah.
All
And
right.
yay.
Michelle,
Michelle, where are you from?
St. Louis, Missouri.
St. Louis. Okay. We've done Soul Shop in St. Louis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
is this Bishop Ray?
No. With Karen Counseling.
Oh,
At the
okay.
Samaritan Counseling Center, they were our hosts. Yeah. And then there was somebody else you said?
Yeah, Bishop, my Bishop Rayford Ray is here.
I joined you.
Oh,
Yeah.
hello.
Yeah,
Bishop.
hi.
Yeah.
Sorry about the delay and getting into the link, but Michelle Snyder has basically been through her entire presentation, so it is.
So now nobody needs to come to
It's-
Soul Shop.
It's been, no. It's been recorded. So for Michelle and Rayford, you can watch it later when we send out, hopefully the right link to get it, to be able to view it.
Okay, thank you.
Too.
That's
Thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you all knew that. I guess, Michelle, my question for you, Michelle, then is most of this is we've got to get the buy-in of the clergy, it sounds like.
Yep.
Okay.
So buy in to bring Soul Shop, or what do you mean?
Well, I mean, to do a culture change, it's got to be led
Yeah.
by the pastor. or-
Yeah. I don't know if it's got to be led by the pastor, but you're absolutely right. Like, so we say that Soul Shop is for faith community leaders. This is a training for faith community leaders. It's not a training for the general population. We do those too, but this is not that. But I would say it doesn't have to be pastors. I use clergy language a lot. I try to mitigate that a little bit, but I would say Soul Shop is for Christian educators, for youth pastors, for deacons, for Stephen ministry, for parish nurses, for mental health ministry folks, anybody that feels passionate about this and wants to carry this torch. I will say that culture change either always or almost always or most effectively starts from the top. So you don't have to have the pastor kind of driving the ship. You do need to have a pastor who's friendly to this idea. So I do church consulting work as well, in addition to suicide prevention. And one of my favorite kind of church consulting quotes, probably Peter Drucker, I don't know, said, one person alone gets creamed when it comes to culture change. One person trying to do it alone gets creamed. Two people together can commiserate, but three people are the beginning of an insurrection. And I think that I love at Soul Shop when you get clusters from congregations, because I think they can begin to brainstorm and that kind of thing. I think you've got to have some critical mass. You've got to have the right people in the room. You've got to have the buy-in of the pastor. I think that's fair. But it is certainly for lay folks as well. And I say, when it comes to classic suicide prevention, our ideal is that every person in a congregation has been trained in basic suicide prevention awareness, with some tips, tools, and resources. So what do you look for? How do you ask the question? And what do I do when somebody says yes? So I think that's every person who works in a camp. I think it's every person who teaches Sunday school. I think it's every VBS volunteer. I think that a church of 300 to 500 could host a Soul Shop by themselves, and I have had that done where 300 or 400 people in a congregation, and they get 50 of them to come out on a Saturday to get trained. So the more people, better. And then one of the things we have done actually, for your purposes, is to take the morning of Soul Shop, where we talk about Job, we talk about the woman with the issue of blood, we talk about that, I do that Isaiah quote, we talk about all of those things, and condensed it into a 90-minute curriculum that pastors can buy. We charge $30 for it. Sometimes well-funded entities, you might say, for instance, in the Upper Peninsula, if AFSP is paying for this entirely, charge $30 per person, and then make curriculum available for everybody who leaves. And so we say, now that you've been trained, take this back and use it once a year with your whole congregation. So we're trying to, our tagline in Soul Shop that we sometimes use is equipping faith community leaders to train their congregations to minister to those impacted by suicidal desperation. That's kind of the long version of what we're trying to do. And I think culture change starts at the top, but requires buy-in all the way to the bottom. And so how do you do that? I would say a methodology for training all the way down.
And Michelle, I think in the Upper Peninsula, you're going to find that, and Rayford, you are much more articulate, and Rick, you're much more articulate about mutual ministry model than I am. We are a non-hierarchical model of ministry. And so we've already sort of taken out you have to do this with priests or deacons or whatever. It's anybody that wants to, and is feel inclined to, can be leaders, are leaders in the congregation, and are empowered to make the decisions within that congregation to bring it forward. And what I love about what you talked about, I always like to do what I call kamikaze formation, which is to get the information out all the time, every newsletter, any little email, like normalize the conversation. And what I'm looking forward to, and from what you said, what I'm looking forward to is having the tools immediately in my hands and in the hands of people that go through Soul Shop here to begin to talk all the time about it. Just like we talk all the time about other things, if it becomes part of our vocabulary to say, hey, but can you remind me about what to look for? Or, hey, removing the stigma of having the conversation. It sounds as though going through Soul Shop, you're going to give us some tools to help us lower that stigma in our, not only our church communities, but in our actual communities.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. So once I've kind of created the case for why you need to care about this, we do some pretty fundamental suicide prevention training. Like I just said, what do you look for? How do you ask? Where do you send people? But we use the call of God in Isaiah, bind up the brokenhearted, release the prisoners, to say we have a call. So that's our acronym, CALL, commit to tell, ask the question, listen, and lead to safety. And so come to Soul Shop, you'll hear more about those. But the first part of that is that as part of our call, I myself will commit to tell if I ever start thinking about suicide. And I have people write down the names of 3 people that they could tell if they ever start thinking about suicide. So we're going to put our seatbelt on before the accident happens. It could happen to any of us. The right set of crises and the right kind of vulnerability and the right lack of resilience, and I might be suicidal myself. And so part of safety is creating a blanket whereby we all have 3 people we could tell if we're ever thinking about suicide. And that's fascinating for pastors, right? Because we like to think about problems being outside the church. We like to believe that this is somebody else's. But I think part of destigmatizing a conversation is to recognize it could happen to me too. So I'm not exempt from this. And when you get pastors to try to write down the names of 3 people that they would tell if they're thinking about suicide, you get some real vulnerability. I mean, the conversation gets pretty vulnerable because most of them don't have 3 people. And what does it look like to get myself safe by doing that? And then I say, so what would it look like if you did this with your whole congregation every Suicide Prevention Sunday, once a year, write down the names of 3 people? And the conversation leads to, well, it would normalize the conversation because we've all got 3 people. This isn't just the sick one over there or whatever. We've created a blanket of understanding that we all could be there. It makes me my brother's keeper in a new way, because I've written down somebody in the church and so we're all kind of watching each other in different ways. And this is the culture change stuff, right? This isn't just about some basic tools and tips. This is about the way you create what we call soul-safe communities. Soul-safe communities are communities that minister to suicidal desperation as a regular aspect of their life and ministry. And I say in Soul Shop, we say suicide because this is what this training is. It's about suicide, but take out the word suicide and just say, take out the word suicide and it's still true. A soul-safe community is one that ministers to desperation as a regular aspect of its life and work. And so in some ways, this training is applicable then to all manner of desperation. Substance abuse and addiction, domestic violence, questions of gender and sexuality where people are feeling desperate and isolated, all kinds of things where if we've got a culture where we know how to have hard conversations, we recognize that it's not just them, it's me too, where we have taught people how to listen and how to be attuned to resources in the community, we've created a soul-safe community for all manner of issues. And we've shifted our culture. Yeah. So anyway, I'm just kind of talking now, but that's what I do. Can I answer any other questions for folks?
I just want to mention is I appreciate the conversation, that you're having in terms of having our communities or wherever being able to speak openly about it and being intentional about it. That's a shift. And even today, we still have that stigma, about all of this. And I was also appreciative, Michelle, where you said it went on beyond in terms of suicide, but it went beyond that. And that's very helpful for us, at least up here, where we can have a workshop and then begin having open conversations around issues, and it'll make us more vulnerable, which will be a good thing because we can get it out on the table. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I always say in a Soul Shop that if you're going to talk about, if you can talk about suicide, you can talk about anything. But also, if you start talking about suicide, you're going to talk about everything, because suicide is not generally about itself. Suicide is because I'm going through a divorce and I've lost custody of my kids. It's because I've got a gambling addiction and I'm drowning in debt. It's because I've got a substance abuse problem. It's because I've got untreated mental illness and can't, so as soon as you go through that choke point of suicide and you open up the conversation, you better be ready to talk about all of it because you're going to talk about all of it. So it does, in some ways, I think one of the weaknesses of Soul Shop is that it seems like a pretty narrow topic. But in fact, it's very broad, and it's really about teaching a methodology. In some ways, you'll learn some things about suicide. I'll talk about prevalence and that kind of thing. But statistics are not not primarily what we do. And I think tools are. I want people to walk away with really concrete takeaways, like in coffee hour, what if you, that level of granular ideas. But on the other hand, I think if you can think that way about suicide, you can think that way about substance abuse or domestic violence. So in that way, I hope it's much broader.
I think it opens up all sorts of Bible studies, because then if we can do a Bible study on suicide, then we can also look at the Bible and say, how many people were drunk in the Bible? Let's have a conversation about that. And then how many people had gender identity issues in the Bible? And let's look at that. And I think that the stigma for mental illness, when you connect it with faith, often has to do with that it's God wouldn't want us to, God wouldn't want us to kill ourselves, so we can't talk about suicide. God wouldn't want us to be inebriated, so we can't talk about drunkenness. God wouldn't want us. And so you're flipping the script on that by saying it's right there in our sacred scripture. So we have a starting point, and you don't have to go to seminary to look at those stories. You don't have to have great theological background. You don't have to have any letters under your past your name. Anybody that's picking up the scripture can see those stories and say, oh my gosh, that's right. Job, those were suicidal words out of Job's lips. And I never realized that. And it helps us to deconstruct this mystery even around our sacred scripture.
Yep. You know, it's fascinating. It's one of my favorite moments in Soul Shop when I talk about how do we preach about this, and I lay out all of these scripture texts. I then break them up into small groups because I've just been talking too much, and I say, you know, what I want you to talk about at your table is what did you hear that was impactful, and how might you use this in your context? Those are the two questions I give them, and I walk around the room, and inevitably what I hear in all these pockets is, I've been hearing those stories my whole life, and it never crossed my mind that they were about suicide. And just yesterday, I've got to do a presentation tomorrow on mental health, more broadly than suicide. So I actually reached out to Faye, and I was like, hey, that thing you did with Soul Shop, help me do that with mental illness. And he said, well, let's take a look at Noah. I mean, Noah was kind of a mess, and he planted a vineyard, and then he got so drunk that, like, I mean, might Noah have had a substance abuse problem? Like, he planted a vineyard, so he had this thing, and he ended up estranged from his children. And like you start deconstructing the story of Noah, like that guy was a train wreck. And I never think about that with Noah, right? So I'm just sharing the in some ways what we're giving people is a new set of lenses to think about this. So I actually have a hard stop at 11. Christopher's selling his house, and they've got somebody coming to do a look at the house. So and I'm in Central Time. But that gives me 5 minutes. Is there anything else I can answer for folks?
I have one more question. What if someone has lost someone to suicide? Does that get addressed in this program, or
It does, yeah.
part of it as well?
Yep. So what's your question?
Well, I guess that's kind of the reason people get interested in it, because they lost someone. So I guess we're talking about prevention, which is wonderful, but I guess, is there a way to comfort those who have suffered already as part of this culture shift?
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that I do in Soul Shop, and we probably don't do quite enough, but one of the things that I do is just start the day. We talk about those who are impacted by the faces of suicidal desperation. So what are those? And I lay out, there are 4 groups of people. And I even say at the beginning, like, if you're, 6% of adults and 17% of adolescents are thinking about suicide. If you're here today and you're thinking about suicide, know that there's hope, know that there's help. Please don't leave without getting the help that you need. We know that it's estimated that about 1/3 of the population has lost someone to suicide. We call those people survivors, and they live with a personal and private pain all their own. I tell a story about a couple people in my husband's church who are survivors of suicide. If you're here today and you've lost someone to suicide, and know how painful it can be to hear all of the things that you wish you would have known and didn't know, right? So I acknowledge it. When we talk about the faces of desperation, we're always talking about all 4 of those. At the end of the day, we talk about some tips for what churches can do to be soul safe, making use of your survivors so that they can tell their stories, being present with them around holidays. So I do sprinkle kind of all of those faces, prevention, intervention, postvention, into how we talk about that. Definitely. Yeah. Somebody asked in the chat, I think it was Anne, for contact information, because different dioceses may be wanting to do this separate, and I would love to talk to you. So I put my email there. I put the Soul Shop website there, and then my phone number. And all of those are good places to reach me, or, Marna's a good point of contact. Yeah. Is Province 5 Heather?
Heather is Province 5.
Okay.
And so I have a message. I actually have it all prepped. It has all of your information in it. I have everybody who's attended today or any suicide prevention network meeting previously. All of the information will be in there. I will also then advertise the correct Zoom link for the rest of the year so everybody can save that. So I've done all of those things. So that email will go out as soon as I get the recording processed from this time. And I do hope that we can work together, right? Part of Province 5's goal is if you find that you're going to do this and that you can open it up to more people, especially if we're talking about we're still on Zoom, please let me know. I'm happy to share it province-wide. Even if you're going to do something in person at some point by the end of this year or next year, there are people that are probably close to you across the diocesan line. And part of my job is to help the communication, right? That's my entire job, is to connect people. So Michelle, if you're going to do something in this geographic area, please let me know. I'm happy to advertise that within the Episcopal Church and the Episcopal networks.
So when you say this geographical area, if you mean the Upper Peninsula, we are, and we have a date on the calendar for that.
I'm in touch with Marna. That's the geographic area. That's Province 5.
Okay, yeah. So we
Ohio,
do.
Illinois, Wisconsin, and half of Missouri.
We have, we do. We have
Great.
2 of them, 3 of them coming up in Michigan in the next year. And that actually is a really good way. Marna's going to do one. So she's coming to Arkansas in May to sit through one. So she does a better job of talking about it in the community. And so I would encourage and recommend that. But on our website, we have a list of all the trainings and events that we have coming up. So you can also go to upcoming events and see what those are. I know that in the next probably 18 months, we've got one scheduled for Ohio. So yeah, we float around.
I will definitely curate that information and include that in the email also. So
Okay. All
And
right.
again, I just want to say I appreciate this, especially as we come out of COVID and the trauma that a lot of this is will be later. I appreciate this a lot. Thank you.
Good. Well, thanks for being here, Bishop. Culture change starts at the top. So it's no small thing that you're championing this work.
We can't thank you enough, Michelle, for sharing with us, and
Mm.
we wish you well with your house.
Thank you. Yeah, well, it's not my house, but I still have to get out of it. So, thank you for the
And it-
invitation.
Sure
I
bless.
hope to see you all